Okay, we carry on. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we looked at last week, declares, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And as I explained last week, I take that phrase, the heavens and the earth, to be a merism, meaning all things other than God. And I understand the beginning to be the subsequently described creation week. So verse 1, it functions as a title or an introductory encapsulation of the creation work that is spelled out in the following verses. So a paraphrase reflecting my understanding would be something like, in the 6 days described below, God created everything that exists. Now, I acknowledge that in taking Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 as a title instead of a separate act of creation, well, that then means that there is no express declaration of creation prior to the description of the material in verse 2, the material from which God fashions the universe of human habitation. But it's implied that the material of verse 2 was created by God in the beginning, during the 6 days, because verse 1 asserts that absolutely everything was created by God in the beginning. So the all-encompassing nature of the merism, it leaves no room for anything to exist that was not created by God in the beginning. Now, I speculated that God may have left his creation of that initial state that's described in verse 2. He may have left his creation of that as an inference instead of declaring his creation of it expressly, because the pagan creation myths of Moses' day, they involve pagan gods fashioning pre-existing matter into the present universe. They didn't attribute the creation of that matter to some other god. So maybe God chose to take up the contrast where the pagan creation stories began, with the shaping of existing material, leaving the creation of that existing material as an inference. You see, so he emphasizes that he, not some pagan god, is the one who fashioned the material into the cosmos, and that he did so in a way different from what was told in those pagan creation myths. Now, on to chapter 1, verse 2. He says, "Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters." So in its initial state, the earth to be, or the proto-earth, was covered by water of unspecified depth, perhaps being inside a giant ball of water. And therefore it was formless in the sense of having no definition, having no features, no relief. So it's formless, and it was also empty, meaning it was uninhabited by living things, and it was shrouded in darkness. And God's intention to transform that initial state is reflected in the fact the Spirit was hovering over the waters. So that's what I take that to be. That is the indication of this is simply an initial state that is going to be turned into the habitation with which the people were familiar. Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5, that the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God. Now, some commentators, they view the state that is described here in verse 2 as something that is ominous and wrong. You see, it's a chaos that is contrary to God's nature and contrary to God's good creation. And therefore they reject the implication of chapter 1, verse 1, that the earth as described in verse 2 was created by God. But I think that restricts unduly the scope of the merism. The heavens and the earth, it's absolutely everything, all things other than God, so you don't have that option. And I also think it reads into verse 2 a dubious negativity. In other words, it casts it as something ominous and, foreboding and negative and contrary to the good God. Well, I just think that's a mistake. I think that's projecting that onto this. Old Testament scholar David Samora, he says, in light of the above, it would be very reasonable to understand the phrase tohu wabohu, or vabohu, in Genesis 1:2, as also describing a state of unproductiveness and emptiness, though the context suggests that this was the initial state of the created earth, rather than a state brought about as a result of God's judgment on the earth or land, as some people sometimes try to say. You see, we had a creation and then God judged it, and that's why it's in this condition. He continues, he says, in conclusion, both the biblical context and the extra-biblical parallels suggest that the phrase tohu vabohu, that's formless and empty, he says in Genesis 1:2, has nothing to do with chaos and simply means emptiness and refers to the earth, which is an empty place, i.e. an unproductive and uninhabited place. Thus, the main reason for the author's mentioning the earth as tohu vabohu in this setting is to inform the audience that the earth is not yet the earth as it was known to them. In other words, here it is, it's this initial creation that is going to be turned into, by the work of God, into the universe and the cosmos with which you're familiar. That's what I think he's talking about. Kenneth Matthews, Old Testament scholar, in his commentary, he says, the description of the earth in verse 2 is best seen as neutral, if not positive. For elsewhere we learn that God is the creator of darkness, Isaiah 45:7, and we recognize also that darkness, evening, was part of the created order the Lord named and deemed good. As we showed at verse 2, the distinctive couplet, tohu vabohu, formless and empty, portrays an earth that is a sterile wasteland awaiting the creative word of God to make it habitable for human life. This is the point of the prophet's appeal to creation. He did not create it, the land, to be empty, tohu, Isaiah 45:18. In his oracle, Isaiah anticipated that the uninhabited Israel will once again know the return of the exilic captives, and spiritually the Gentiles who submit to the God of Israel will join Israel in its salvation. The passage speaks to the purposes of God, who as creator will achieve his salvific ends for all people. This is borne out by the term parallel to tohu in verse 18, which shows purpose, but formed it, the land, to be inhabited. Thus the prophet asserted that the Lord did not create the earth to remain tohu, but rather to become a residence for man. Finally, the three parallel clauses in verse 2's description of the earth include Spirit of God who prepares the earth for the creative commands to follow. This suggests that the earth's elements are not portraying a negative picture, but rather a neutral, sterile landscape created by God and subject to his protection. So I go through that because people want to say that no, verse 2 can't come right initially from the hand of God because it's so contrary to the nature of God. I don't think so. I know it comes from him because in the beginning, in the 6 days, he created everything. Heavens and the earth, everything. There's no room for anything else. And still, I think you're also reading into that this negativity that's not there. So I don't think that works, that complaint and that objection works. Now, as I pointed out repeatedly, right, it's implied that God brought this initial state here in verse 2 into being, but nothing said about how he did so. And that just doesn't sit well with people. And that's why they don't like when it's a title or an introductory encapsulation. I want to have some description of how this 2 got here, verse 2. I'm just saying, it looks to me like you're just going to get it's implied he created it. Because his focus is going to be elsewhere, right? Since absolutely everything was created by God in the beginning in 6 days. You see in Exodus 20, verse 11, 31:17, in 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth. He created absolutely everything. So that's where this is included. There's no room, as I say, outside of that for him. No room for anything to exist outside of that, and no room for anything to come into existence other than in the 6 days. And so that's how I take that. Then he says in verses 3 to 5, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day, or one day. The actual description now, the actual express description of God's creative work, it begins here in verse 3 as he starts to fashion this formless and empty world, earth, that is shrouded in darkness. He starts to fashion that into the universe of human habitation, the cosmos and the reality that we know. And God speaks light into existence. And then in verses 4 and 5, he creates the phenomenon of day and night. Daytime and nighttime, which is the most basic rhythm of human experience. Right? That is the most fundamental cycle and rhythm of human experience. Daytime and nighttime. And from his description here, it seems that light, as God first created it, it illuminated all of the submerged earth, meaning it came from all directions. And then it comes from all directions. And then to create the phenomenon of day and night, to separate light from darkness, God localized the source of light. So it looks from this description, he creates light that comes to the submerged earth from all directions, and then he separates the light from the darkness by localizing that source of light so that it then shines on the earth from only one direction. And he then begins rotating the earth so that as the light shines from one direction, we have light, and then we have evening, and then we have morning one day. So he then, in that, he creates daytime and nighttime. He creates day and night by doing that. Now, some, of course, balk at the idea of light and the phenomenon of day and night existing before the creation of heavenly bodies, specifically before the creation of the sun. That won't come until day 4. And they say, how in the world can we have light and day and night when we don't have the sun? Well, it's a miracle. Right? The whole creation account is a miracle. This is what God is doing, right? You see, for example, the eschatological light, the light at the end time, it doesn't have its source in the sun or the moon. For example, in Revelation 21:23, and the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. Revelation 22:5, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. So, as the eschatological state requires no light, well, in sunlight. Well, here, God creates the light. He creates it miraculously. There was no sun needed for that light. Right? I just think, you think God cannot create light from a source? He's got to create the sun. That's the only way God... I always tell people, look, he can have donkeys sing an opera if he wants to. Right? I mean, I just don't get it. But... so here you see Victor Hamilton's a very well-known Old Testament scholar, who wrote the commentary in the New International Commentary in the Old Testament series. He says, it will perhaps strike the reader of this story as unusual that its author affirms the existence of light, and a day for that matter, without the existence of the sun, which is still 3 days away. The creation of light anticipates the creation of sunlight. Eventually, the task of separating the light from the darkness will be assigned to the heavenly luminaries. It is unnecessary to explain such a claim as reflecting scientific ignorance. What the author states is that God caused the light to shine from a source other than the sun for the first 3 days. Right. Just like he spoke it into being. So that's what God is doing there. And then verse 5, it ends with this refrain where it says, and there was evening, and there was morning, and then it says either the first day or one day. Okay, see, unlike the other days that you have, second, third, fourth, unlike those days, the number that is used here on this beginning day is a cardinal number rather than an ordinal number. In other words, it means one instead of first. All of the others are ordinal numbers, second, third, fourth. This one is a cardinal number. And that's why the phrase is rendered one day. In a number of English translations, American Standard, Revised Standard, New American Standard, Christian Standard Bible, you have a number of them that take it that way, that give force to the cardinal number and say one day. Now, if that's correct, to go ahead and to give that cardinal number force, well, then what's happening is that Moses is defining day. He's defining day by specifying that a day and night, you see, there was evening and there was morning, that a day and night, daytime and nighttime together constitute one day. So he's defining day for you. If that's right, you see, that identical phrase that is used there in verse 5 shows up 3 other times in the Pentateuch. Okay, Moses, the author of the Pentateuch, shows up 3 other times there in Genesis 27:45, 33:13, Numbers 11:19. And each of those instances, it clearly refers to a single ordinary day, one day. So that may be what Moses is doing. But most English translations, most English versions render this cardinal number, though it's a cardinal number, they render it as an ordinal number. They render it, as you see, this is the English Standard Version, as the first day, meaning, they take it as the first day because it can have that meaning. When it's used, when a cardinal number is used in a series like this, it can take on the meaning of an ordinal number. So you have a number of translations that do that. So I'm just reluctant to press the point that Moses in chapter 1 verse 5, that he's expressly defining a day by telling you it's a period of daytime and nighttime one day. Now he may be, but I'm reluctant to lean too hard on that. But even if Moses did not specify in verse 5 that a day consisted of a combined period of day and night, the evidence is overwhelming. That day in verse 5 and in the other days of creation, it's a normal day with which his readers were familiar, a day of 24 hours. Now, this is recognized by the vast majority of Old Testament scholars, leading world-class Hebraists, all recognize that in the context he's talking about a single day. Now, many of those guys today, they say, yes, clearly he means a regular day, an ordinary day. But they then say, but that doesn't mean that he's talking about that he actually created over 6 days. Because they say he's using them as ordinary days, but he's doing it as part of a literary scheme that makes a larger figurative point. So although they acknowledge that he's using the day as day, they get around the idea that it's actually a week because they say he's doing it as a part of a literary scheme. One of these ways is a framework theory. Another is analogical days, like framework. The first 3 days he's creating things. The next 3 days he's filling them. You see, he's using days as real days, but he's not trying to communicate to you that he actually created over this week. Okay, there are significant problems with the framework theory. There are significant problems with the analogical days theory, where they say, yes, these are real days, but God is simply characterizing the work he did over vast stretches of time as having done it in literal days, simply for you. He didn't really do it over literally. He's portraying what he did as your kind of days. Okay, there are problems with that. I just don't want to chase all those. If you'll go to the paper that I have online, this paper, and other things I've written out there. You can I have cited in the footnotes links to critiques of the framework theory. I have a critique that I've published of the analogical days. You can do that. I just don't want to spend the time to do that. My point here is that leading Hebrew experts understand, whether they kind of get around it by saying it's part of a literary scheme or not, they understand that day here means day. So almost nobody of any altitude in terms of being a biblical Hebrew scholar goes with the notion that no, day really means a long period of time. This day-age thing. I mean, there were people who used to say that at some point, but that's certainly gone by now. Okay, I'm not saying no one would do that. I would never say no one, because you dig around, you find everything. But I'm just saying that that's not really on the table these days. Okay, but the Hebrew scholars recognize. Let me give you some examples. I could give you more than this. I'm going to give you 5. Okay, and I could give you more, but Marcus Dodds, he's writing in the late 1800s, late 19th century. He was a world-class Hebraist. Marcus Dodds says they are the Bible's worst friends who distort its words that they may yield a meaning more in accordance with scientific truth. If, for example, the word day in these chapters does not mean a period of 24 hours, the interpretation of Scripture is hopeless. Okay, I kind of look at it that way, you know. Gordon Wenham, this is 1987 in his Commentary and Word Biblical Commentary series, famous Old Testament scholar in England. He says there can be little doubt that here, verse 5, day has its basic sense of a 24-hour period. Alan Ross, who taught at Dallas, he may still be there, Dallas Theological Seminary, well-known Hebraist. Ross says, in this chapter, however, day must carry its normal meaning. It seems inescapable that Genesis presents the creation in 6 days. John Steck, he writes this, another Old Testament scholar writes this in 1990. Surely there is no sign or hint within the narrative of Genesis 1 itself that the author thought his days to be irregular designations, first a series of undefined periods and then a series of solar days, or that the days he bounded with evening and morning could possibly be understood as long eons of time. His language is plain and simple, and he speaks in plain and simple terms of one of the most common elements in humanity's experience of the world. And John Walton says, we cannot be content to ask, can the word yom bear the meaning I would like it to have? We must instead try to determine what the author and audience would have understood from the usage in the context. With this latter issue before us, it is extremely difficult to conclude that anything other than a 24-hour day was intended. It's not the text that causes people to think otherwise, only the demands of trying to harmonize with modern science. And I think that's what happens, and that's what drives so much of this, is that people are convinced, listen, science has demonstrated this is impossible and I don't want to look stupid. Okay? So let me go ahead and see if and then everybody runs it. Yeah. Get us off the intellectual hook. We don't want to be embarrassed, so just say these things, that'll be great. Okay? I just don't think that's how to treat the text. Now, I could say a lot about science. I'm going to give you just a little bit of how I approach this when we get further along. Okay? I'm not going to delve into a lot of this stuff. Steve does, semesters on it. But I think I'll give you the basic way I approach it, and I hope that'll be helpful to you to see that we have nothing to run from, you see, in that regard. So you have these scholars saying, in addition to this, the premier Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon, which is Kohler and Baumgartner. The premier lexicon lists Genesis chapter 1, verse 5 as the first entry under the definition yom, day of 24 hours. So in that dictionary, Kohler and Baumgartner, yom, gives definitions. One of those definitions is day of 24 hours, and the first entry under that definition is Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. Okay, so there's nothing screwball about it, right? There's nothing, this fundamentalist hayseed is over here. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So there you have that. And in fact, Manny Sabo, in the acclaimed Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, which is like a 17-volume series, he includes Yom, day, in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 5, as referring to a full day of 24 hours. All right, so I think that's pretty clear. And here is how Kenneth Keithley and Mark Rooker, this is how they sketch the evidence that the days of creation in the creation account here, that they are normal days. Here is their just kind of outline of that evidence. In Genesis 1, the creation days are referenced with a number to refer to each successive day of the creation week. First, second, third, all right. Elsewhere in Scripture, when the word day, yom, is used with a number, it always refers to a 24-hour day. The same is true when the word occurs in the singular, day versus days, and is not found with a compound grammatical construction. In other words, if it occurs in the singular and is found with a compound grammatical, well, then it might not. But when it occurs in the singular without that, it always means day, such as the object of a preposition, the object of an infinitive construct. Moreover, there are additional reasons from the context of Genesis 1 to suggest that the day is a normal 24-hour period. Specifically, the employment of the formula evening and morning occurring with the 6 creation days. The occurrence of the phrase evening and morning, with or without the occurrence of the word day, refers consistently to literal 24-hour days in the Old Testament. A second line of support for understanding that literal 24-hour days are in view in Genesis 1 has to do with the Sabbath law in the Ten Commandments. The law of the Sabbath requires man to work for 6 days during the week, but then rest on the 7th day, the Sabbath, from all his labors. This was a command given to Israel. The reason for this pattern, according to the record of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, is that God worked 6 days and then rested, ceased from his labors on the 7th day, Exodus 20:8-11. As humans, and I put in Israelites, are called to imitate God by this work pattern, it is understood that the model for the Sabbath is based on literal 24-hour periods of time, and the basis for this understanding comes from the use of days in Genesis 1. E.J. Young, who was a very famous Old Testament scholar at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, he says, E.J. Young comments on the logic of this reasoning when he says, in Exodus 20:11, the activity of God is presented to man as a pattern. And this fact presupposes that there was a reality in the activity of God which man is to follow. How could man be held accountable for working 6 days if God himself had not actually worked for 6 days? Hence, the Ten Commandments take the word day as referring to 24-hour periods within the weekly cycle as God provided an example for mankind's labor. Now, here's what is said in the note in the New English translation, the note for Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. That says, the exegetical evidence suggests the word day in this chapter refers to a literal 24-hour day. It is true the word can refer to a longer period of time, Isaiah 61:2, or the idiom in the day, like if we say back in the day, we're talking about it back in long, right? Words can function that way, but it says, but this chapter uses day, night, morning, evening, years, seasons. Consistency would require sorting out how all these terms could be used to express ages. Also, when the Hebrew word yom is used with a numerical adjective, it refers to a literal day. Furthermore, the commandment to keep the Sabbath clearly favors this interpretation. One is to work for 6 days and then rest on the 7th, just as God did when he worked at creation. So it just seems hard to miss. And I think if there wasn't this pressure where we think that can't be right because that's been shown to be impossible. Okay? It hasn't been shown to be impossible. I know our culture says that. I grew up here. I was trained here. I understand all this. Okay? But when you start to dig and start to think about assumptions and how things work, you'll find out, hey, this isn't like, watching something drop. These are inferences that are being made. Okay? And I'll say a little bit about that, but I won't go into that heavily. Now, the overwhelming majority of early Christian scholars, leaders, thinkers, the overwhelming majority of them understood creation to have occurred over the course of 6 ordinary days. Right? I mean, that means something, right? We're reading the same text. And so we have all of these early Christians who understood it that way. This includes men like Theophilus of Antioch, Methodius, Lactantius, Victorinus of Petau, Ephraim the Syrian, Basil of Caesarea, Cyril of Jerusalem, and Ambrose of Milan. All of these well-known figures recognized how this was being used. And this was the standard view. This was the consensus understanding of Christians, as reflected in the fact that Celsus, or Celsus, who was a critic, he was a pagan critic of Christianity in the late 2nd century, he ridiculed the idea that Christians held that God created over the course of 6 days, as though God was required to do that. What kind of a God you got just doesn't blow it all out instantly? You see, you got him working like a farmhand. You see? Well, God's doing something, obviously, right? But that was so you see, though, in the criticism, that was how people understood it, right? And that remained the consensus understanding for many centuries, all the way through the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. John Feinberg, in his book is called No One Like Him. He says, though at various times in church history, some questioned whether the days of creation were literal solar days. You have people saying that, this is symbolic of something. Very few early, but he says here, the predominant view, at least until the 1700s, was that the days of creation were 6 24-hour days. So I just don't see, if I read it this way, I can see somebody if they want to disagree, but don't look at it like you're reading it stupidly. I'm reading it as everybody else did, right? Until yesterday. Right? I'm standing in this great stream. There are all of these reasons for reading it that way. And so no apologies needed for that. I think that's what God is saying. Now, some people, they say, well, look, you're just naive because, the days of creation need not be regular days because you, silly person, are probably not aware that 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8 says that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years are like, there you go. Right? Now you think about, why did all these other people not know that? Right? But I hope you see that there's a problem with this kind of thing. Old Testament scholar Todd Beale, he says passages such as Psalm 90 chapter 90 verse 4 and 2 Peter 3:8 have little bearing on the discussion of Yom, day, in Genesis 1. In both texts, a comparison is made. 1,000 years in God's sight are like a day. In no case is it suggested that the actual word day really stands for a longer period of time. The point is that what might seem like a long time for us, given our limited lifespan, specifically referenced in Psalm 90:10, is really not a very long time at all from the Lord's standpoint. In Genesis 1, there are no such comparative particles indicating a comparison. In fact, neither Psalm 90 verse 4 nor 2 Peter 3:8 have anything to do with the days of the creation week. And there's another article, somebody didn't sign it, but I still liked it, so I'm reading it to you. It says, some who hold to old earth creationism use 2 Peter 3:8 to bolster their view that the days of Genesis 1 were not literal days, but long eons of time. If a day is like 1,000 years, the reasoning goes, well, then the word day in the creation narrative cannot mean a literal 24-hour day. The problem is that God is not attempting to redefine our words in 2 Peter 3:8. Peter does not say that one day is 1,000 years. He says one day is like 1,000 years. In other words, he's using figurative language to make his point. The point is not that we should interpret the word day as 1,000 years everywhere we find it in Scripture. Rather, the point is that the passing of time has no bearing on God's faithfulness to his promises. And I think that's the right way to read it and understand it. Now, because it was not until day 4 that the role of light source, that miraculously created light source that shone from one direction onto the earth, it wasn't until day 4 that the role of light source was transferred to the sun. Well, some claim, well, then it's a mistake to think that the first 3 days of creation, that they were the same length as the other days of creation after we have the creation of the sun and the role of light source transferred. So that wasn't the source of the light. So therefore, we shouldn't think that those days are the same length as the other days. Well, I don't find that very persuasive. Okay? The problem is well summarized in my judgment by John Feinberg, and he says, even if there is no sun, God still has the earth revolving on its axis, and he knows how long his activities took. Hence, even if sun, moon, and stars are not in place until day 4, the events of the first 3 days still could have lasted 24 hours apiece. God would know how long from our perspective his actions took. So when Genesis 1 tells us that the first 3 days were equal to the next 3, that's enough reason to think all 6 days equal in length. A miracle-working, omniscient God who could create the whole universe surely knows how to calculate time in that universe at any stage of its existence. And John Whitcomb, similarly, he says, we may assume that the first 3 days of creation were the same length as the last 3 days, in reference to which God set lights in the heavens for seasons, for days, and for years. Because exactly the same descriptive phrases are used of each group of 3 days. Why is he trying to fool you into thinking, these are really not like those, but I'm going to describe them exactly like those? I just don't, why would I think that? Right? I just think that only if I had a reason to try to think that, I wouldn't think. He says, the fact the sun was not created until the 4th day does not make the first 3 days long periods of time. For on the first day, God created a localized light source in the heaven in reference to which the rotating earth passed through the same night-day cycle. Surely Genesis 1:14 is intended to lock the days of creation into the well-known time units of astronomy. For if days in this verse are not literal days, then what are years? You see, I just think you run into these problems, these things wind up getting strained because, in my judgment, the reading is driven by an external thing. And as I said, that's how I approach this in my early Christian life, till my epiphany. Caught myself, what I was doing, it dawned on me that I was not reading this. I was trying to find what I could make it mean, instead of sitting here saying, talk to me. You see, what are you trying to communicate? I wasn't doing that. I was doing this other stuff. Right. It's unclear now whether Moses intended the first day to begin with darkness, the darkness of verse 2, or the light of verse 3. Right? How does he intend the day? There was evening, there was morning, the first day. Now, there are many people. Wenham is one. Sailhammer, Steinman, well-known Old Testament scholars who favor the idea that he intends day to begin with the darkness and not the morning. But I am with those who think that the day is best reckoned from morning to morning, from light to light. Okay? For example, just to let you know that I'm not alone, Gerhard von Rad, a German theologian, scholar, dead now, says, the day here appears to be reckoned from morning to morning in strange contrast to its reckoning in the cultic law. Nahum Sarna, Jewish scholar, as Rashbam, who's a famous Jewish rabbi, noted, the day is here seen to begin with the dawn. Kyle and Delitzsch, the days of creation are not reckoned from evening to evening, but from morning to morning. You see, God, as I look at this, God creates the daylight, which turns into, so he creates the daylight, which then turns into evening, nighttime, and then it comes back around to morning. See, that's how it looks to me, and I think that better fits the refrain. There was evening, there was me. He creates light, there was evening, nighttime, there was morning, okay, the first day. So that's what I think is more likely. But if that's correct, well, then you have a question, right? If that's the right way of reading this, well, then how is the ex nihilo creation of that material in verse 2, how can that be considered as having taken place on the first day, as required by the fact everything, the heavens and the earth, everything was made in 6 days? To put it pointedly, and I'm going to run out of time, I see, but to put it pointedly, if the first day began with the creation of light and the material in verse 2 existed before that light, how was that material created on the first day? Right? That's the question. And I think that it assumes a more technical beginning of the day than Moses intends to convey. Now, why do I say that? Because everything's created in 6 days, and God's work begins, the recorded work, the described work, where he says, let there be light, with this performative statement. In other words, the statement that brings into being what he says, that is God's work. You see, that is his work on the other days. And yet that work takes place in darkness, because it is let there be light. But everyone recognizes that that is part of God's creative work on the first day, his creating light. Yet it precedes light by what? A fraction? Right? And yet Moses still says it's on the first day because everything is created in the 6 days. So I look at that and I say, all right, so it happened right at the same time. It immediately preceded the appearance of light, and that for Moses is good enough to include it in the first day. I say, well, what if this material in verse 2 likewise appeared immediately before the pronouncement, let there be light? And in God's power, certainly these things can come. Everything is instantaneous and nearly simultaneous. So as I'm looking at this, God here, he just, you see, just right at the moment. So I don't think that bars what I'm saying to you. Now, if you think it does, then maybe you'd be with those people who say, I think the day begins in the darkness. But I just don't think that doesn't sit well with me, because of the there was evening, there was morning the first day. Okay, so that's something I want to bring to your attention. So that's the idea there. That likewise, just like his work there is part of day one, even though preceding the appearance of light, if all these things likewise happen immediately before the appearance of light, then they too could be included as part of the first day. It's just not that technical, I don't think. At least the way Moses is communicating it. Well, I have 24 seconds, so I don't think I'll start verses 6 through 8. No, actually I have minus 30 seconds, so I'm over time. Thanks. Term parallel to, I left out 2 there. So Bernard hates it when I do this. I left out 2 in that slide.